Welcome back, everyone. Well, just before the break, we were discussing new allegations being levelled at Supreme Court Justice nominee Brett Kavanaugh. We want to have more on that. Of course, the week ahead being the confirmation hearings for Mr. Kavanaugh. So Richard Johnson joins us now to discuss a week that promises to captivate the US political world. He is a lecturer on US politics and international relations at Lancaster University. Good to have you with us.
Thank you for having me.
So, a new allegation of sexual misconduct against Brett Kavanaugh has surfaced in the New Yorker magazine involving a second woman, but her story has not been corroborated to any great degree from her freshman year at Yale. As the Senate Judiciary Committee prepares to hear testimony Thursday from Christine Blasey Ford regarding her sexual misconduct allegations against Kavanaugh, could these new allegations potentially be a game changer and force the committee to hit the pause button and investigate these allegations?
Well, the committee really can't afford any more delays. The Senate goes out of session for the elections on the 26th of October. And really between now and then, if the Senate needs to have further questioning and scrutiny, that have to go through the committee and then onto the Senate floor. And really we could get to a point where we get up to the elections without a final vote on the Senate floor of the Supreme Court nominee. Now, I suspect that's what the Democrats might be hoping happens, that they delay this sufficiently, that then the elections happen, and then they maybe make it politically impossible for a new nominee, to get through in the lame duck session. There's been precedent for this. In 1968, the Republicans filibustered Lyndon Johnson's nominee for Chief Justice of the United States, Abe Fortas, in October 1968, so roughly the same period of time as now.
Sorry to interrupt you, but
Sure.
an investigation would take maybe 3 days. So, I mean, we're not talking about a huge delay here. And the reality is that any change in the midterm elections, that's not going to have any impact until the new year. So Brett Kavanaugh denies this ever happening, right, and says it's a smear campaign against him. He says he looks forward to testifying Thursday and defending his good name, but wouldn't an investigation help him do just that? Rather than this effort to rush the confirmation hearings through as quickly as possible and leave the impression that all of these allegations sort of left hanging, basically and essentially a stain against Brett Kavanaugh. It's in his interest.
Well, if we think of another historical parallel, in 1991, during the Anita Hill testimony, Clarence Thomas responded, he came out swinging in response to her testimony. He denied all of the accusations. He famously said that he was the subject of a high-tech lynching. He said that he'd been lynched and caricatured by the United States Senate rather than hung from a tree. So he came out with this very, very strong response, and in the end, he was successfully confirmed. We have to remember this is not...
Right, and he had an investigation. There was an investigation for him, and in that situation too, there were witnesses for both sides. So there was this sense that you weren't getting a he said, she said scenario where you're not actually hearing from all of those involved, right?
Well, at the end of the day, the United States Senate is a political body. It's not a court. The Senate Judiciary Committee is not a jury. There won't be any verdict on guilt or innocence on this. And so the real question is about whether or not this shifts the political reality in the Senate. And it could well do. I think at the moment, the situation has made it much more plausible that you'll get unanimous Democratic opposition to this nomination, which wasn't so clear earlier on. You had some senators, Democratic senators in battleground states in the Senate elections, like North Dakota, Ohio, and so on, Indiana, West Virginia, where we thought perhaps there might be a few Democrats who voted for Kavanaugh. That's not going to happen now. And now eyes are on the two female Republican senators, Lisa Murkowski in Alaska and Susan Collins in Maine. And whether or not there's conclusive evidence, whether or not there's something that might have stood up in a jury trial, doesn't really matter. What matters is whether or not this puts enough political pressure on them to consider their support.
Right, but the aim here is to make sure that the person who's going to be confirmed for the highest court in the land has the integrity that is required of a justice of a court of that standing. Just very quickly, before this second allegation went public, we also learned that the mock questioning with Kavanaugh in preparation for his own testimony Thursday was not going well because he was refusing to answer some questions that he found too personal. How problematic could that prove to be on Thursday when he will have to answer some of those questions?
Well, it may or may not actually change any minds in the United States Senate, but it certainly has repercussions in the court of public opinion more broadly. And again, I think in 1991, some of those Democratic senators were very uncomfortable with the way that they questioned Anita Hill. And in the end, you had, in the following spring, Alan Dixon, an incumbent Democratic senator from Illinois, who actually lost his primary to Carol Moseley Braun, a black woman who became the first African-American woman elected to the United States Senate. So even if Kavanaugh doesn't, maybe votes don't change in the way that Kavanaugh answers the questions this week, but it could change minds when people go to the ballot box in November, and Democrats might be, they might lose the vote, but they might claim the electoral victory in a few weeks' time.
Right. Of course, the aim of all of this is to get to the truth of the matter, isn't it? To determine what we're dealing with here and who's telling the truth. We will see. Richard Johnson, thank you so much for joining us. Appreciate it.
Thank you.